Hello, everyone. I'm Mariette DiCristina, Dean of Boston University's College of Communication. I'm also a COM alum myself and the parent of a recent BU grad. It's my genuine pleasure to introduce today's discussion, Why PR Has the Ear of C-Suite Leaders. Today's event is part of our series of virtual events called Com Talks, featuring topics and experts in journalism, advertising, public relations, film, television, and media science. Today's event will be recorded and will be available later to watch on either COM's website or its YouTube channel. Over the past year, companies and organizations have faced turbulence from all sides. One effect is that public relations plays a greater role in businesses and strategy than ever before. Another effect, crisis management and listening are now top skills needed by PR pros. These and other findings are explored in the Bellwether Survey of public relations practitioners from across the country in COM's annual study with the good folks at PR Week, and it was just released. It's essential reading for professionals in the industry and is now available for purchase or download at prweek.com. Today's panel will touch on some of the survey's highlights as a springboard to what I expect will be a fascinating discussion on the state of public relations. And now it's a pleasure to introduce today's panel. First, let's please say hello to Ray Kotcher, who's the former global CEO of Ketchum, one of the world's largest and most decorated PR agencies. He's also another proud COM alum and formerly taught at the college here as professor of the practice. Ray's honors are many. He's a member of the Hall of Fame of the Arthur W. Page Society, the preeminent professional society for senior communication professionals. He was also awarded the Alexander Hamilton Medal for a lifetime contribution to the public relations profession by the Institute for Public Relations, as well as the Public Relations Society of America's Gold Anvil, that society's highest individual honor for lifetime achievement. Ray, thanks a million for joining us today. Great to see you.
Thank you, Mariette. That was very kind. Thank you for asking us.
Now let's say hello to Arunima Krishna, who is an assistant professor of public relations here at COM. Her research focuses on public's perceptions of controversial social issues, such as anti-vaccine activism, climate change, and workplace gender discrimination. She earned her PhD at Purdue University. And together, Ray and Arunima are the lead researchers for the Bellwether Survey published in partnership with PR Week. Thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Krishna.
Thank you very much for having us.
And serving as moderator for today's discussion is Gary Sheffer. Gary is the Sandra R. Frazier Professor of Public Relations here at COM and a past recipient of the Becker Family Teacher of the Year Award, perhaps the college's highest honor for teaching. Prior to Boston University's, Gary was Chief Communication Officer at General Electric, and while there, he was elected as chairman of the board of the Arthur W. Page Society, a premier organization for senior communicators. Before GE, Gary served as press officer to New York governors as well. Thank you, Gary, for joining, and thanks everyone for attending today's event. I'll now turn it over to Gary, and Gary, you can take it from here.
Thank you, Mariette, and thanks to those of you who have joined us for this discussion. Before we dive in, a word about our format today. I'll get the ball rolling with some questions, but in a bit, members of our online audience will be able to pose their own questions for the panel. And you can submit those questions via the Q&A tab in Zoom, and we'll get to as many as we can over the next roughly 60 minutes. So why don't we get started? I'm going to start with Arunima. And so why don't you tell us the basics of the Bellwether Survey that BU does with our partners at PR Week. When was it fielded? Who did it reach? And what did it ask?
Yeah, thank you very much, Gary, and thank you everyone for being here and listening to us talk about the survey results. This is the 5th annual Bellwether Survey, which is a collaboration between Boston University's College of Communication and PR Week, which, as you know, is one of the preeminent trade publications in public relations. This survey, the 5th annual survey, was fielded between May 1st and June 15th of 2022. And if you recall that time, it feels like a long time ago, but it was in the middle of global inflationary pressures. The Russia-Ukraine war had just started. the Supreme Court memo had just been leaked, and we were still, well, the decision had not come out by the time we had closed the survey, but the memo had been released. We were also facing continuing pressures from the COVID-19 pandemic and just the domino effect of the pandemic of the last 2 years. And so this year we wanted to understand from the profession, what role are you playing in your organizations? How valued are you? And this has come out from previous years where we've steadily seen an increase in how valued professionals feel, the PR function feels in their organization, agencies feel valued by their clients and by their top managements, and so on and so forth. We wanted to understand and really unpack that finding and try to understand where that value lies. What issues are PR practitioners most involved in? Do they have the ear of the CEO and the C-suite? And if so, about what issues? To what extent are they involved in these issues? And what does their organization's activism look like? How involved are organizations in issues, key social issues of the day? How involved is the PR profession in taking a stand on those issues and being part of those conversations? And of course, as educators, we are always interested in understanding what the future of the profession looks like, to make sure that we prepare our students most effectively for the future of the profession. And so those are the basic questions that we asked. We were fortunate enough to get almost 1,500 responses from around the world, mostly in the United States. About 60% to 70% of our participants are in-house practitioners, and the rest are agency professionals. And we're able to collect data through PR Week's subscription base, as well as our partners, the PRSA. The PRSA is kind enough to send out the survey to their membership as well. And of course, our research team has several contacts that we're able to reach out to request them to take the survey as well. And so that's how we get to that number.
Terrific. So let's dive into the results of this survey. I'll turn to Ray. Ray, the title of the report, the survey results for the Bellwether Survey, is Comms in Command. What exactly is comms in command of these days?
Sure. First of all, it's wonderful to see so many smiling friends on today's Zoom call, and hello to everybody. We've, as Arunima said, as Dr. Krishna said, we've been fielding this survey now. This is our 5th year. And to put it into a nutshell, the most important and I think heartening finding, although there were some issues that arose, but the most heartening finding that we saw in the data, and it was an overwhelming response, was that over the 5 years, there is no doubt about it, but the appreciation for public relations and communications practitioners inside organizations, as well as on the agency side, has never been greater. It's been growing every single year. Our respondents told us that they have never felt more valued than they do now by their management or their clients. And they have a seat at the table. And in a nutshell, that was the most important finding, although there are many, many others, and some that might be a little bit of a warning sign as well, but we'll get into those in a little while, I'm sure.
Yeah, Ray, before we do more specifics, I'd love your point of view, your perspective on looking at this survey and then the sort of catalog of the past 5 years of these surveys. How healthy is the PR industry right now, given the turbulence that we've been through with the pandemic and sort of waxing and waning of business, of need for talent? How would you characterize right now the health of the PR industry?
I think that for those students who are out there, those recent graduates who are out there listening to this today, or might be listening in a replay of this, I think the good news is that the health of the business has never been better. The talent market is robust, and anecdotally, I can tell you this from speaking to friends in the agency business. And Gary, as I'm sure you know from the corporate and client side, the hunt for talent, the need for talent has never been greater. So
Yes.
those that are entering the job market today, those that are there building their careers, the world is their oyster at this moment. And that is the number one, seems to be the number one challenge right now for those who are leading agencies and leading corporate communications department, is finding those good people.
Well, let's look at some of the results too, which speak to that, Ray, I think, and the value that you mentioned about the communications function in the PR profession. I noted in the results that 71% of practitioners who responded say they were deeply involved in their organization's COVID response, and that 60% feel more valued in the past year, and that more communicators are involved in the overall strategy because of the value they delivered during the pandemic. Do you, Arunima, Ray, do either of you see this as a temporary sort of phenomenon? In other words, my experience in business, sometimes these things wax and wane, right? The HR rises, legal rises, that kind of thing. How do you see it, and what's in the survey to tell us whether the seat we've earned is something that's going to be permanent?
You want to take that one, or would like me to begin? Or
yeah, I can start off and not move, jump ahead into a different question you have, Gary. But I think one of the greatest pieces of value that the comms function, the PR function, was able to deliver was the inherent understanding of internal communication. And so that's something that we saw in the open-ended questions that we asked. We saw it in the data as well, that more and more practitioners report spending a whole lot of time on internal communication and employee engagement, much more so than they did in the past year. And in fact, a lot of respondents talked about how they're revamping how they do internal and employee engagement, not just in terms of recruitment, but also retention of employees in the face of the so-called Great Resignation and so on. But there's a whole overhaul of how internal communication and employee engagement is being done. And that's a really interesting quote I wanted to share with you. It's something that one of our participants shared with us, and they said, "We're looking to personalize the company through its people and actions internally. Internal comms strategy is probably our biggest focus in the next 2 years as we get everything aligned and ramped up." And I think comms, the PR function, is in a unique situation to be able to do that, to be able to drive that strategy and drive that aspect of the business internally. And so it's a matter of capitalizing on this unique opportunity, a silver lining, if you may, of the pandemic.
It's interesting how the external events that we've seen over the past 2 years or more, George Floyd, the pandemic, Ukraine, et cetera, have made internal communications all that more important.
Absolutely.
Right?
And nothing really is internal anymore. What is it's not purely internal. What is internal is external, as United found out to its detriment. And we're learning from that playbook that what is internal, if it isn't commensurate with what you're doing externally, you're going to have an authenticity crisis. And I think companies are realizing that.
Ray, I want to get your point of view on this. It seems natural, given external events, that comm would come to the fore on in-house value, if you will, and contribution. What do you think is the most important thing for communicators as they think about it to keep that seat at the table that they've earned? One of the things, by the way, I've heard from CCOs and others is we might have too many seats at the table right now.
Right. Well, let me just take that apart a little bit. If we think back to, I guess it was March of 2020, when the pandemic really broke in this country, and all the government policies and issues were facing us, and we had so much work to do as civil society, as individuals, as a government. It was it was an extraordinary historical moment that many of us lived through. Unfortunately, we lost a lot of people too. But if you think back on those days, and when we were teaching, and again, I'll go back to the students at that point in time. They were facing into a very questionable job market. And if you think about what was happening to the organizations that they were looking to work in, whether they be corporations, not-for-profits, agencies, in a matter of days, those organizations, every institution across the board, had to pivot really fast. I mean, really fast, in lightning speed. And most of them started, to Arunima's point, with their employees. How are the employees going to come to work? How are they going to communicate? What were the technology tools that they were going to have to utilize if they hadn't been utilizing them in the past? And how are they going to interface with their customers and with their clients? We had to learn all that in a week, 2 weeks. I mean, everything was changed really fast. It kind of ripped the Band-Aid off, and in lightning speed, we all had to change our behaviors. And that is why so many organizations looked to their communicators, looked to their public relations people to help with that internal change, that behavioral change that had to take place really, really fast. As every institution around the world was being dramatically disrupted in the way they did business. When you look at the data that we have, as Arunima said, the communications professionals overwhelmingly said that internal communications, change management is and was their primary job, even today. So, yeah. We were looked to, and we seized the day, and we helped provide tremendous value to the organizations that asked the public relations and communications people to step up in that regard.
Yeah, and I want to say too, my focus, my background is in-house, but I have to say there are so many really great agencies these days that deal with culture, specialize in culture, change management. And, I learned so much from them during my time as a CCO. And I just think they keep getting better and better. And for young people at BU and other places, man, that's a place where you're going to find a lot of work going forward, given this internal focus that so many companies and others, organizations are emphasizing.
Yeah, you're right. They're hiring. They're hiring like crazy in that regard. Yeah, and if you think about it, again, just going back to the students and the recent graduates who are out there in the job market. Today the job market has changed dramatically, but it was really because organizations were able to make that pivot. It was a question as to whether these organizations would even survive.
Exactly.
In those first few months, and they did, and they got better, and they prospered. And today's job outlook, it seems to be much more robust and much more healthy.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. The communications function has maybe the broadest view of the world in an organization, next to the CEO, let's say. And I think that kind of perspective was really necessary or needed over the last 2 years. And Ray, we were talking about this yesterday. You said, we're sort of like the dog that's caught the bus. Now what do you do? Which is true. And I wonder, looking at the data, One of the things that was expressed in it, there's a little bit of, I mean, it's been a rough 2 years. And there's a little bit of fatigue going on, I think, among communication teams. And so I wanted to ask a question about Arunima or Ray, sort of the leadership aspect of this. How do you sustain this sort of leadership and constant sense of crises in leading communications functions, whether it's in-house or within agencies?
Ray, would you like to start?
I can begin, sure.
Yeah.
Well, look, there's no shortage. Unfortunately, there's no shortage of crises these days. Exogenously out there, in the world, and when you look to to individual business sectors, the pace of change, the kind of change that's coming at us, the magnitude, the importance, the gravity of the change in many cases has never been greater. And we have some really interesting data that I will ask Arunima to look to. As you look at some of the specific issues that we did drill in on, what was interesting is that public relations communications people are involved in many of those issues, but some they're not. Now, when we first took a look at the data, Arunima and I had very long discussions about, okay, well, why are some issues that public relations and communications people are being asked to deal with, and some are not? So now I'm going to kind of go off the grid here a little bit. I'm just going to hypothesize. We're going to need a lot more research to confirm some of these hypotheses. But I would say there are two things at play. Number one is that now that the public relations people and communications people do have a seat at the table, and I have used that metaphor before about the dog chasing the car. Now what do? It is understanding business and understanding business strategy, and that's one of the things I'm so proud of at COM. Is that when I was there, we and all of us, all of my colleagues, Gary, Arunima, Dr. Wright, I mean the whole crowd, really worked hard to make sure that understanding business fundamentals was a required class. You can't be a communicator and offer advice and offer strategic insights and advice unless you understand the underlying business issues. And now it's required of every COM undergrad and grad student to take a class in business fundamentals, which I think is just terrific. So I think that, now that we have the seat at the table, if we don't understand business strategy and the underlying business fundamentals and what drives a business, we're not going to have that seat very long. And particularly if you're an individual who doesn't understand it.
Yeah.
Here's the second thing that I would say too, and now I'm really
now you're rolling.
Now I'm going out on, but I'm also I'm really getting into the hypothetical here. But I think this is an area of real interest that we need to pay attention to as public relations and communications professionals. If you take a look at the whole world of ESG and the tremendous amount of money, as an example, that's been invested into ESG funds, which are fundamentally about social responsibility and socially responsible investing and environmental investing and good governance. The money going into those funds had historically been high. Mm-hmm. Now money is being withdrawn from those funds. And there are growing questions about that as an investment strategy. Is it an investment strategy that's going to stick for the long term? And if you take a look at the pension funds in many states around the country, they are now being directed not to invest based on political issues, mm-hmm. of which environmental, social, and governance and some corporate governance issues are considered political issues. Disney in Florida is an example of what I'm talking about there. So it could be out there that companies are becoming much more reticent and much more thoughtful, I think, about what issues, and I'm talking about the top management, the chief executives, the boards of companies, are really being thoughtful now about whether they should engage on certain issues, and if they do, what are the likely, what's the likely outcome of that? And so it could be, and I'm going to ask Arunima to get into this part of the data because it's really fascinating. Some of the issues, particularly if you go back to that area in the spring of this year, some issues clearly were issues that that needed to be communicated on. Others not, and even if you fast forward to today, I think you still see the same thing. Some issues are issues that you got to double down on, and some could be you've got to be careful about getting into them. So I think that might be something at play here that's really worth public relations and communications people looking at.
Arunima, do you want to dive into the data on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So something we were very surprised on initially. So let me back up for a second. We asked participants whether they or their clients, because we also have agency participants, had taken a stand on about 11 issues. So that was a yes/no question. And so these issues included voting rights, climate change, vaccine mandates, racial equality, reproductive justice, immigration, the situation in Ukraine, and political polarization. There were several of these issues. We then asked to what extent were the PR and comms functions involved in these decisions about whether or not to take a stand. What we found was that most companies had not really taken a stand on most issues. So the one issue that really stood out for everybody was racial equality. And so 80%, 81 to 83% of the participants said that, yes, our companies took a stand on racial equality and the comms function was involved in it. Most participants, and remember, this is just when the Supreme Court memo on Roe v. Wade had leaked out.
Yep.
Only 11% of our corporate participants said that they had taken a stand. The rest, not so much. And it wasn't even a blip on the PR practitioners' radar. Same with immigration, same with political polarization. Climate change was another somewhat salient issue, as were vaccine mandates. Gender equality was another one, but most others were sort of on the side. LGBTQIA issues were also salient as issues that companies had taken a stand on. Now, I think there are two things that are probably happening here, or I can infer a few things from this data. The first is that I think companies choose and weigh which issues to take a stand on based on what their employees expect them to do. And so the employees, because of activism, because of heavy investment in employee engagement, companies have a better sense of what employees expect of them. And employees are far less reticent now in expressing what they want their organizations to do. We recently wrote a chapter on employee activism, cheap plug, that delves deeper into these kinds of issues to talk about when and how employees express themselves against their organizations and charge them to take a stand for or against an issue. We saw that with Wayfair with their ICE collaboration that was going to happen. And so on issues that organizations think their employees are affected or will be affected or want them to take a stand, they are more likely to take a stand on. That's what we're seeing with gender equality, racial equality, vaccine mandates, and the situation in Ukraine. The others, not so much. The other aspect of this, in my estimation, is companies want to take a stand on issues about which they have something meaningful to say. And so with reproductive justice, for example, LIFT, with the SB 8 bill in Texas last year, LIFT took a stand because that was an issue relevant to their business. And if anyone's interested in reading more about that issue, Boston University students did a fantastic study on this issue. It won the Grand Prize Award at the Page Society case study competitions. Again, cheap plug, I apologize, but it's a really good case study if in case you're more interested in, if you would like to read further about this issue.
You know, in that case, in the Lyft case, the question was whether one of their drivers, if they drove someone to an abortion clinic, for example,
Exactly.
what the liability would be for the company. And therefore, it is completely a salient issue for them and their people. By the way, Rhea, and I just want to remind, before I come back to something you've said and ask you about it, remind our listeners and viewers that they can submit questions through the Q&A function and ask us anything about the PR industry today and where it stands. There is a wokelash. I read an article the other day about what you mentioned in some of the states in which the pension funds are being directed away from companies that are perceived to be woke in the eyes of certain politicians, and that it reminds us that politics has invaded everything.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's not, there is very little separation between business and politics in the US, particularly today. So I've got two questions on that. First is for Arunima, actually, is what does that mean for communications education and the PR curriculum that we're teaching? I can tell you, I taught yesterday 2 sessions of the business acumen class, and I love it, and students love it. It's something they haven't seen before in their academic careers.
Yeah.
And so how do we think about all these things? I'm sort of throwing a lot of things at you, I know, but how do we think about what we teach in the classroom now, given all we know?
Yeah, I think Ray hit the nail on the head in that having strong business acumen and understanding business strategy is crucial to the success of our students. It's crucial to the success of the PR function in the corporate world. Just because without that, they're not going to get a seat at the table, and they're not going to retain the seat at the table. That's why I'm also very proud that our students get that education, even if they don't feel the need for it right now. Hopefully they appreciate it 10 years down the line and remember, oh, Professor Sheffer talked about this. Maybe I should have listened a little bit more. So that's one component of it, certainly. Another component of it that I think speaks to the value of public relations that I saw in the data on the future is how important listening is. And when I say listening, this listening is different from social listening. Social listening is more about data and analytics and about social media, sentiment, and all of that. That is important, but that's separate from what we are talking about. The listening we are talking about is listening to the C-suite, listening for what their priorities are, listening for business strategy, and processing it and making sure that they are able to speak the language, speak the jargon, but also contribute to it. Not just be within the silo of PR comms, but also be able to hit the brief, and not just the brief, but also the corporate goal or the business mission and so on. So I think all of this conversation ties into that very strongly, because at the end of the day, when you're trying to, and this is, I'll steal your words, Gary, from class the other day, when you're trying to decide what to say and how to say it, you fall back on your values.
Mm-hmm.
But if as a comms person, if you don't know what the values are, you're not going to be able to do a good job with that.
It's so, I'm really interested in that finding of the survey, by the way, because the other one was handling crises as the number one, which I guess is understandable given what we've been through, but it replaced listening and crises, knocked writing out of the first position, which breaks my heart a little bit as an English literature major. So certainly writing still highly valued.
Yes.
Right. But I love the listening part of that. I forget who said it, but communications without listening is just noise. Right. and we forget that sometimes in the hurly-burly of handling some of these things that are going on. Ray, what I wanted to ask you was, you've been a coach, a counselor to many executives and over the years, and so what you strive for is always to build trust with those CEOs, with those executive suite folks. How do we think about that today, given everything we've just talked about, the need for business acumen, the emergence of ESG, the rising expectations for companies to speak out? How does a CCO or an agency leader develop all of those skills that you need to really end up being a trusted counselor to some of the most important organizations in the world?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and I think that it goes back to, we were touching before, and I think you briefly asked the question and touched on the topic of what do we need to be making sure that we're emphasizing in the curriculum for our students today, and there are a couple things that I would say in that regard. You need to have a broad international perspective. If you think about, well, I know, Gary, you were deeply involved, in international issues when you were at GE. You were doing business in many different, well, almost every country around the world, literally. And if you think about the politics, the business customs and practices in all those countries, it's something that I do hope that we spend more time on with our students. And unless you, as a counselor and as a communicator, as an agency person, really are able to bring that broad perspective that chief executives have and into the discussion, you're going to be bringing a very narrow point of view to the table. So I think having that international perspective, that global perspective today more than ever, if you think about it, think about, we were moving towards globalism. There was some degree of homogeneity going on, but now the whole thing has become fractured, and every country is kind of off on their own and trying to make their way in the world. And our biggest trading partners, in China, a perfect example. Our paths have diverged. And so how do you bring valuable insight to an executive who's trying to figure out how they communicate when so much of the market is the Chinese market and the United States market simultaneously? So that's the first thing that I would say. Second thing that I would say is, we're going back to the question, Arunima brought up the importance of employees, and I think it's important to understand, employee bases are not homogenous, and certainly are no longer homogenous, particularly as society in this country becomes much more fractured. I'll just parenthetically just look at the election that took place in Brazil on Sunday, and the surprising results, and how fractionated that country is. But so it's happening everywhere around the world. And I was having a very interesting discussion with a chief communications officer not that long ago, and she works for a gigantic power company. And she said, our greatest challenge is that the people who are working up on the poles and hanging wires have a very different worldview. And the people who are sitting down the hall from me, are coming in to work in the office every day. So I think that understanding the constituencies that companies are dealing with, and helping, and I guess this is probably the most important thing, really, is that top management are trying to figure out how they manage through disruption. How do they move? How do they turn on a dime like we all had to in the pandemic?
Right.
But that's happening every single day. Think about the businesses that have been disrupted, just in the past, 5 or 10 years. Think what Amazon did to the retail business, just as an example. And you can go down the list in every single sector, and the businesses are totally, totally different. And the CEOs and top management of the successful organizations are the ones that understand that they need to navigate this change. And the first order of business is getting their employees along with them on that journey. And if they don't get their employees with them, they're not going anywhere.
That's
because
right.
the employees are interfacing with the customers. And then if they don't get the customers with them, they don't have a business.
That's right.
So I think that getting the trust of top executives and being able to speak with them, and then how we train our young people, I think these are really, along with the business fundamentals, are really important things to think about.
Ray, I think you're so right. When I was at GE, and my attitude was, or the realization was, I was never going to be the smartest person in the room, right? With all of these engineers and lawyers and scientists, but I always wanted to be the most informed person in the room.
That's a good way of looking at it, Gary. And don't underestimate yourself. You've got a lot of brain power too. So.
Well, here's a question that Arunima, I think in our Q&A section here, I think is a good one. When looking for my first post-grad job in PR, how can I find companies/executives that value communications? Are there questions I should ask in an interview to gain insight into their attitude toward comm?
Okay, I can get us started. I think the one thing you can look out for is to see where communication or the PR function reports into. Are they reporting? Is there look at their leadership page, right? Is there a chief communication officer, or is there a chief marketing officer that also has communication under them, right? As part of their portfolio. That might give you some insight about how much comms is valued by the CEO and by the C-suite. That'll give you one hint, right? Ask about how big is the team? What are there agency partners that you use? Inquire about what the agency partners do. So are they primarily for external comms? Are they primarily for crisis communication and so on? These are the kinds of questions you can sort of ask to suss out these kinds of how valued the function is in the organization.
Yeah,
Ray,
I think that's right. I remember I tell the students, the interviews are not just them interviewing you.
Yeah.
When you're in a job interview, you're interviewing them as well too. And Absolutely. You can suss out some of that attitude as you talk to HR, as you talk to partners, to the communications function, and ask them how they interact with the communications team. And you'll get a good sense for whether it's valued or not by talking to some of those folks. Okay. Here's another question from the folks watching or listening. With internal communications playing such an important role in today's corporate world, is top management actively listening and leaning on professionally trained practitioners in communication strategies to convey messages, or is there pushback? I can tell you there is pushback. They listen, but they push back. And from my experience, it is everyone comes at these big issues with a certain perspective. And the legal perspective, the HR perspective, you name it, operations, supply chain, and often it's the communicator who's in the hub of this conversation and has to make decisions or recommendations on how it's what will be done and how it's worded, and that is a pretty cool job, actually. And but again, you have to understand the business, how it makes money, who its people are, all of those kinds of things. So I can answer that definitively. They push back, and I don't mean to say that they're pushing back on doing the right thing. They're pushing back based on their perspectives and what they perceive as best for stakeholders, been my experience.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, here we go. Here's another question. How do you define the role of a CCO? I will say, just having been one, and I think the data shows this, it's changed. It changed. I became a CCO in the early 2000s, and I stopped being one in 2016, and the job was 100% different than when I started. From a technology standpoint, from a social expectations standpoint for transparency. So I would define the CCO as sort of the conscience of the organization to a certain degree. But I also feel like communications in many ways has become whatever they are, tendons, ligaments, whatever that ties, holds everything together often. And finally, I would say, and more, maybe most importantly, the storyteller for the organization. And that doesn't mean you tell stories in a fictitious way. That means you understand the culture, the values, the strategy, and you try to tell that story to the world, good and bad. Okay. Let's go to a couple other questions that are coming in now. This is from a colleague. I don't have a question, just want Arunima, Gary, and Ray to know how amazing they are. Such impressive responses. Well, I shouldn't have done that. That's making me blush now. Thank you for that. That's great. And maybe Ray, you've had some experience with this. What are the benefits and detractions from PR reporting up through marketing?
Ooh, that's a
loaded question.
Well, it's an important question too, because that's something that Arunima and I have looked at over the past 5 years about where the reporting relationships for communicators are. And Arunima, I'll ask you to validate my broad statement here. But if I'm correct, over the years, marketing has communications has reported on an increasing basis into the marketing side. Am I right about that?
So, if I may add some texture to that.
You're asking me to. I'm asking myself to remember over a 5-year period.
So over the years, what we found is, so traditionally PR would be under marketing, right? That was the traditional way of doing things, as a promotional piece or the press conference piece or the publicity piece. In the last 5 years, since we started doing the survey, we found that that folks were reporting that PR and marketing were integrated rather than in a subordinate situation. So more and more functions are integrating their PR and comms rather than putting one in, above the other. And so you'll have for example, you'll have a chief marketing and communications officer or chief communications and marketing officer, rather than just a chief marketing officer who also has culture or comms under their portfolio. So just to add a little bit of texture to what Ray said, we're seeing the pattern of integration between marketing and PR and comms.
Right. So thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, and I would say, Ray, I would just say too that I'm a big believer that reporting and who's a dotted line and solid line is often irrelevant. And it's about relationships and trust and building those things inside an organization. And I often talk to the students about sort of their internal knowledge infrastructure, right? Where you can reach out to people, particularly with speed, to find answers to questions. And so I think we spend a lot of time worrying about reporting lines. And more importantly, I try to focus on building relationships.
Go ahead,
Ray.
I'll just add to that. It's not necessarily a terrible thing.
Right.
In many cases, it can be an advantage. And I think that if you take a look at what's happening out in the world, and how all of these functions and communications modalities and communications disciplines are kind of collapsing on each other. I think that's a reflection of what's really happening out there in the real world. I think to your point, Gary, and I couldn't agree with you more. And I believe that our research at one point, we did look at this over a year or two. The important thing is that for the public relations and communications person, as long as they had that direct relationship with the chief executive, and when public relations and communications was needed, were they called on? Were they did they feel comfortable bringing that advice to the top management? As long as that exists, I agree with you. I think that I think that that where public relations reports is not is not the most important thing. And I think it's actually, as I said, kind of a reflection of what's happening out there in the real world. And we can bring all those different tools together symphonically, then you have a really powerful proposition, communications proposition.
Absolutely. I do want to touch on one thing in the survey, the Bellwether survey that BU did with PR Week. And it's about diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, which has obviously been a focus in agencies and companies over the past few years. Many of those organizations said they would improve their diversity on their teams. As a result, they made pledges or hired DEI officers, made contributions. Yet in the Bellwether survey, only 31% of respondents say their organization is changing in response to the events of 2020. Does the survey tell us why such a low number, Arunima or Ray, why such a low number there that people feel actually some change is taking place?
Well, part of it is that change like this comes slowly. It takes cultural change, it takes cultural shifts, it takes, hiring the right personnel. So I think it takes time to do that, to see that kind of change. Or heck, to even make that kind of change, it takes years. So I think that's part of it. Unfortunately, part of it also is that, so we had an open-ended question about this, and unfortunately, we did see a lot of participants say that, yeah, all of that stuff that they said in 2020, that corporate America said in 2020, was mostly just lip service. There are some companies that absolutely have a genuine commitment, that are trying to do better, but that takes time. And in a world where we want instant gratification, it's difficult to get that in issues that are as complex as changing a system or overhauling a system that has existed for so many years. And it's important to do so, but there are companies working toward it. It's slow progress.
Yeah, it's really interesting. That one jumped out of me. There are really good initiatives going on, Diversity Action Alliance inside the PR profession.
Yeah.
That's a coalition of folks. And so hopefully we'll see some real change there. Ray, one quick question as we come toward the end here. You're a data person.
Really?
Yeah, that's what you tell me anyway. And in the survey, it shows essentially, I guess the easiest way to put it is that there's a little bit of a slow uptake on the part of communicators of data-driven analysis and insights. Any thoughts about that, Ray? The PR profession has emphasized data for a long time, has ComTech, all of these initiatives, but the uptake seems a bit slow, according to the Bellwether survey.
Yeah, it's so powerful when you can harness the data and you can use it for predictively, and start to use it as a guide and a map for where your communications is going to go. the data, the evidence is irrefutable that it really can be extremely powerful. I'll tell you another area that troubles me to a degree too, about that we've seen traditionally over the 5 years, very low response on, is the area of misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, which you might want to call it's not the hijacking of data, it's kind of the hijacking of the mind. And that's an area that actually so many of the countries around the world are getting very adept at, and utilizing social media for that. And it's not, and they're corporate, they're institutional. It's not just societal. I mean, they're institutional targets as well. And being able to deal with the malinformation, the disinformation, and the misinformation is something that I think public relations people and communications people are going to need to ramp up on pretty quickly, because I think this phenomenon is just going to explode, honestly.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, the area of data and analytics and misinformation, I think, are areas that we really need to be thinking about for the future of our profession. Data, and I would say data and analytics management is there. I think we probably need to catch up. Malinformation, disinformation, misinformation, I'm not sure that top management is there yet. We have an opportunity to really lead the way on that.
I agree. And thankfully, Ray, we have great researchers like Dr. Krishna doing terrific work in that area, really illuminating work that's helping practitioners understand where we go from here on misinformation and all its on all the problems it causes. So I think that's about it for the time. As you can tell, we could talk forever, right, about this, but really terrific to talk to Ray and Arunima about the BU PR Week Bellwether Survey. It really is a catalog, an encyclopedia of information that tells us where we are and where we want to go in public relations. So a great body of work, peer-reviewed, right? Arunima, I'm saying that right? Peer-reviewed.
Yes, we certainly do academic research and send those out for peer review out of this data.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so that's all the time we have.
Sorry, before we sign off, there is a question from the dean, and we don't want to.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see it.
Right, I know we're up against time here, but she's actually saying that she's saying that I see so many of our former comm students now in leadership roles.
Yes.
Is there a connection between leadership and communication? And I think the answer is absolutely. I'll let Arunima and Gary weigh in, with the final thought on that.
Well, I would say specifically, I know a lot of folks who are very talented communicators from a skills standpoint, and they don't succeed because they're not good leaders, right? So this aspect of business acumen is part and parcel of that, is understanding what strategy is and how to lead it, how to develop it, and all of that. So I completely agree. I bump into comm people in different kinds of roles all the time. And I think it's a reflection of the fact that you get such a diverse understanding of the world and of people in communications that it makes you a better leader. Great. So that's all the time, as unless Ray's going to jump in again. I'm
done jumping. Thank you. It was a joy being with everybody.
So final thanks to our panelists, Ray and Arunima, and goodbye to everybody. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Gary. Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you.